I have to comment on my disappointment that the Minister has left, Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform has left, given that the government rather disingenuously earlier on the confidence motion spent a lot of their time claiming that members of the opposition weren't here. But it was part of a, well, we'll see to what extent anybody really bought it, but part of a fairly concerted effort to prevent the real substantial discussion about what is actually happening on a key area of public investment to solve the housing crisis in this country, which is blighting the lives of so many people. And of course, the tabling of a confidence motion when originally there was a no confidence motion allowed the government to dominate the debate and minimise the ability of the opposition to put forward their case. So that's part of the sort of parliamentary game playing that goes on in here. And then we have a debate which actually is dealing with substance when it comes to what is actually being spent by different government departments, or what was not spent but what was supposed to be spent by government departments. This debate, which is helpful for the government, will be completely ignored by the media. Virtually no TDs here for the discussion about the money that's actually spent and not spent. But when you do examine the money that was spent and the money that was not spent, you learn certain things that are really provide a slightly more tangible evidence about the various claims and counterclaims that are being made about government policy, and particularly in the area of housing. And the startling figure in terms of the carryovers for expenditure, which is money that was allocated to be spent but wasn't spent, by far the biggest figure in all of that, and it doesn't tell the full story, is the figure for the housing department. €340 million that will be carried over to next year because it wasn't spent, and that was part of a bigger figure of 700 million. And indeed, the Minister might illuminate, I think, if I understand correctly, that the maximum carryover can only be 10% of the original allocation. So this is not the full picture of what was not spent, because you're only allowed carry over a certain amount. But 340 million is a huge amount, and then there was other money that wasn't spent that should have been spent on housing. And I will certainly argue that a lot of the money we did spend on housing was wasteful expenditure that doesn't actually help deal with the housing crisis. But it is a shocking fact that you cannot spend 700 million euro in the teeth of an absolutely extraordinary housing crisis. And then, of course, you look at the figures and you can see this, but again, this is the stuff that doesn't really get out there. But people, sort of, you might call them the nerds, but very useful nerds, like Mel Reynolds, the housing commentator, who puts figures together each year on the actual delivery of public housing. They're really quite telling, but it explains why all this money wasn't spent. So Mel Reynolds looks at not just what the government sort of claim they're going to build or spend in terms of housing, but what actually is happening to the public housing stock. Is there more public houses at the end of the year than there was at the beginning of the year? Because that would actually tell you something. And here's a fact. Dublin City Council in 2017 had 24,990 houses, local authority houses. 5 years later, they had 24,722, minus 268. 268 less. After all the money that's being spent or not spent, and all the claims about we're going to ramp up the investment in public housing, Dublin City Council has 268 less local authority houses than it had 5 years ago. Quite extraordinary. Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown's done slightly better. It's gained 35 local authority houses in 5 years. Fingal County Council in 5 years has gained 780, which sounds a lot better when you're dealing with a minus figure or 35, but when you're dealing with thousands and thousands of families on a housing list, that's pretty disastrous too. South Dublin County Council, 452 additional after 5 years in the epicentres of the housing crisis. As I've mentioned before in the Dáil, local authority houses, additional houses built by Dublin City Council in the first 2 quarters of this year, 0, Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown, 0, Fingal, 0, South Dublin County Council, 0. So how do the government manage to claim that they're going to deliver 9,000 social houses and a few thousand additional affordable houses when this is the actuality of what's happening? The total number of new local authority houses and approved housing body houses, 1,632 in the first 6 months of this year. So how do they manage to then claim that they're nearly or not far off meeting their targets? They haven't spent the money and these are the actual figures. Well, of course, because what they do then is lease or through HAPs deliver the social housing that the state hasn't built itself. But that is an enormous waste of money. So if we take, for example, the biggest landlord in the country, Oireachtas, do you know how much profit they are making on every tenant on average? Study just came out in the last while. 50%. 50% profit on every single tenant, on rents that are through the roof, and a huge amount of that is being paid by the taxpayer. Huge amount in HAPs, RAS and leasing payments to these landlords who are seeing absolutely extraordinary increases in their profits. And you can say the same then for Cairn Homes, who saw their profit margins jump by I think it was 167% in the last year. The biggest owner of zoned building land in Dublin City. Extraordinary profits, but again, we end up paying for a lot of that because we will buy the affordable housing off them. And this is why, of course, we did vote against the government's affordable housing bill, because the affordable housing bill explicitly linked the prices of affordable housing to the market prices. Explicitly. It said it was going to be benchmarked against market prices. Something of a discount, but market prices that are manipulated upwards to astronomical levels by the likes of Cairn Homes, where we have 70,000, more than 70,000 planning permissions for apartments, but only 5,000 apartments being delivered each year for the last number of years. So these people drip feed the construction so that prices stay high, that rents stay high, and then the state and the tenants or the house buyers pay through the absolute nose because these people are manipulating the entire situation. But when it comes to the actual allocation for the state to do the cost-effective thing, which is to build its own housing on its own land and cut out the profit margins of the Oireachtas and the Cairn Homes, complete failure to deliver and a failure even to spend the money that was allocated to do precisely that. That is the reality, the terrible reality. And then the government, being the mouthpiece for these very same people, then gets on and says, actually, it's not because of all that we have a housing crisis. No, it's because somebody objected somewhere to a housing development. when we've tens of thousands of planning permissions which aren't being commenced by these people. And what we'll do is we'll make it easier for the developers to get rezoned land or get planning permission so they can have even more assets, land assets, and control even more of the market to rob even more money from tenants, house buyers, and from the public purse in terms of appropriations. It really, I mean, it would make you sick.
Thank you, Deputy.